Do we start?
Yeah, I'm just going to introduce everybody here. So on behalf of the University of Manitoba, Archives and Special Collections, the Slavic Collection of the Elizabeth Defoe Library, the Department of German and Slavic Studies, and members of our organizing committee, I would like to welcome each and every one of you to the 28th Annual J.B. Rudnyckyj Distinguished Lecture with our esteemed guest speaker, Dr. Sergei Medvedev. The funding of this lecture is made possible through the generosity of the J.B. Rudnyckyj Endowment. This donation was given on the condition that an annual lecture be held in Winnipeg with an internationally acknowledged scholar to speak on topics of interest in Slavic and East European studies. The endowment was established in 1992 by Dr. Yaroslav Rudnyckyj, who in 1949 was appointed the first head of the University of Manitoba's newly created Department of Slavic Studies. This was a position he held until his retirement in 1977. The annual J.B. Rudnyckyj Distinguished Lecture Series was launched in 1994, and since then, this series has brought several noted speakers, among them Chrystia Freeland, former Canadian Minister of Foreign Affairs and our current Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, journalist Victor Malerik, and prominent author and historian Timothy Snyder. This lecture series would not be possible without the Department of German and Slavic Studies. I would like to welcome and introduce Professor Irina Konstantyuk, Senior Instructor of Ukrainian Russian Languages and Ukrainian Culture, and she is also a member of our lecture committee. Professor Konstantyuk.
Thank you, Heather, and dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. We have quite an international lecture because I know we have some guests who are with us today from Ukraine. As Heather mentioned, the lectures are jointly sponsored by the Department of German and Slavic Studies, the Elizabeth Defoe Library Slavic Collection, and the University of Manitoba Archives and Special Collections. It is funded by an endowment established by J.B. Rudnyckyj. At the Department of German and Slavic Studies, we offer programs in German, Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, Hungarian languages, literature, and culture. The department also offers the Central and Eastern European Studies program for students interested in comprehensive studies of the region. Department also offers student exchange and summer travel programs in Europe, in Germany, in Ukraine, in Russia, in Poland. And in past years, many students from our programs have spent part or all of an academic year in Europe. These programs give participants a linguistic and cultural expertise, which is difficult to acquire in any other way. All of our exchange and summer study travel programs allow students to receive credit toward the University of Manitoba degree. And also the department offers extensive awards, scholarships, and bursaries each year at all levels of study, ranging from $100 to over $1,000 to students who perform well in individual courses. I'd like to ask Ksenia Zaika, our contract instructor with the University of Winnipeg, to introduce Professor Medvedev. Ksenia was a graduate student at the High School of Economics in Moscow, and Sergei was a professor there. He was on the academic committee when Ksenia was taking her comprehensive exams. She was impressed with Professor Medvedev's academic approach and perspectives, and since that time, she has been following the academic and his academic and journalist career. Thank you.
So, everybody, I'm pretty nervous, but I'm really honored to introduce our outstanding speaker from Moscow, Sergei Medvedev. Sergei Medvedev is a professor at the Free University in Moscow right now. Before recently, he was one of the most, or even the most high-profile professor at the High School of Economics. Dr. Medvedev is Moscow-born and Moscow and internationally trained. He has a PhD in history, specializing in political history, cultural studies, and sociology. His academic course, Russian Space and Russian State, was one of the most highly rated by the students at the High School of Economics. Dr. Medvedev is also a prominent media figure in Russia. In my view, his most famous program, Archaeology, is broadcasted on the Radio Liberty and focuses on Russian society, history, and culture. Dr. Medvedev has written several books, including Mapping European Security After Kosovo, Identity Politics in Wider Europe, and his latest book, The Return of the Russian Leviathan, which focuses on Putin's Russia. And this book has won the Pushkin House Book Prize in 2020 as the best English language nonfiction book on Russia. Dr. Medvedev is unique in producing integrated approach to narrate about the past as it reveals in the present, amalgamating history, politics, sociology, literature, and pop culture. It is my honor to greet Dr. Medvedev.
Thank you, Ksenia, and I thank the committee and the university to have the chance to speak to you. It's a great honor to be in this distinguished lineup of speakers to honor J.B. Rudnyckyj here, and to be able to communicate across the ocean and across the time zones. So actually, what I would like to talk about today is my sense of astonishment at the transformation that my country, Russia, has underwent in the past 20 years. Basically, it's a very personal approach to contemporary political history because of this sense of amazement trying to figure out what happened to my country. You know, like Michael Moore made his famous movie, "Where's My Country, Dude?" he asked of George Bush. So it's the same kind of "Where's my country, dude?" question as I see my country making a 180 degrees turn in the past 20 years, emerging from a, well, not a fledgling democracy, but a nascent democracy, a free society with freedom of speech, with just normal operating market economy with some kind of electoral contention. And suddenly this country turning into a new edition of the Soviet Union, an autocracy, a certified autocracy, relying on the use of brute force against its own population, killing and poisoning its political opponents, threatening the neighboring countries, and pursuing a policy of isolation in the world. So it's really interesting for me how this all transpired before my own eyes. And I devote much of my research in my recent book, which Ksenia cited here, The Return of the Russian Leviathan, is also an attempt to answer this question. So actually, I approach this with a dual feeling, kind of a schizophrenic feeling. Because on the one hand, as I said, there's a frustration. There's a frustration of a Russian citizen, somebody who was standing on the steps of the Moscow's White House in August 1991, seeing the fall of the Soviet Union, and you know, it collapsed in 3 days during the August Putsch in 1991, and the new independent nations emerged. And then through the turmoil of the 1990s, which yet managed to preserve the democratic heritage, then the 2 decades of the 21st century, I saw this thousand subtractions, the death of freedom by a thousand subtractions, the death of liberty, of individual liberty by a thousand subtractions. So there's, on the one hand, there's a frustration, but on the other hand, there's a curiosity, because as Ksenia mentioned, I'm a political historian, and for a political historian, it's an amazing history lesson. It's an amazing sight to see all of the previous patterns of Russian history, which I normally teach in class, suddenly reify themselves, suddenly implement themselves before our own eyes in Russia in the 21st century. So we see something from the 16th century, from the 18th century, from the 19th century, from the Soviet period, which is now being implemented in Russian politics. So Russian history replays itself once again before our own eyes. So with this dual feeling of frustration and curiosity, I will approach this lecture. And actually, I have to start with the perennial patterns of Russian history, which I think are all written down in Russian space. Because as they often say, Russia has history, Russia has geography instead of history. Russia's history is written down in this breadth of this huge landmass, of this Eurasian landmass. So Russia was in a process of perpetual expansion for the past 600 years, since the times of Ivan III, the emergence of Muscovy, the Moscow Principality. And since then, having crossed the Volga in Kazan in 1552, which was taken over by Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, the grandson of Ivan III, Russia was on a perpetual expansion. It was a perpetual frontier country, colonizing its own territory. Russia's speed of territorial expansion really is mind-boggling. As Richard Pipes had once calculated, this was 50,000 square kilometers per year for the next 300 years. And it continued, of course, in 20th century after the Second World War, as the Soviet troops were in the center of Europe. The Red Army was there. And then it continued in some sense also in a third dimension in space, because the Soviet space exploration was part of this spatial destiny of the Russian civilization. But this kind of huge territorial project, building the biggest empire, the biggest territorial land empire in the world's history, it also necessitated a certain kind of statehood, a big state, a state with a strongly centralized power, a state which didn't accept any sort of federalism, which just copied itself across all regional capitals, which didn't allow for any significant regional autonomy, didn't allow for any free society. Russian society has historically been also a part of the state. It wasn't emerging as a counterbalance to the state, right? As we have a normal interplay between the political society, the economic society, and the civil society. Not in Russia. We just had one big omnipresent state, the Leviathan, may I use this metaphor from Hobbes. And then the state was making the society. It was making citizenship. It was making the economy. So necessitated by this huge space and the strategic requirements that were built inside the space, the big territorial expansion, the development of roads and infrastructure, the perpetual wars which Russia was leading with, having with the Great Steppe on the one edge, and with the emerging modern empires of Europe on the other end. So Russia was perpetually leading a war. And this has created a very strong military kind of state in Russia. And this has also created a very strong control of the state over the economy. Indeed, as some people say, Russia never had the economy in a proper sense. Right, because there was an economy is something where people engage in free exchange of goods, right, on the scarce conditions and the conditions of scarcity. In the Russian conditions, there was a state possessing the national resources and then distributing these resources and administering the resources with its strategic priorities in mind. So, and this was the pattern which continued through at least 500 years of Russian history. So in a sense, Russia never had a proper economy. It had what the Germans would say Wirtschaft, what in Russians they call Народное хозяйство, right? There's no English word even for this word, because this is, so to say, not an economy of exchange, but an economy of distribution, an economy of gifts. The state was giving gifts to the land, to the population. So no free society, no free economy, no free territory, federalism. So this was one big state, one big Leviathan, which engaged in a big project of colonizing its country. Here's an interesting theory which I would like to quote from a good friend of mine, Professor Alexander Etkind, who is currently with the European University in Florence, on his book called Internal Colonization. I think it explains a lot in the making of the Russian statehood. Russia was an empire which colonized its own territory, right? Because like if you compare Russia with other empires, like the British Empire, the French Empire, the German, the Belgian, whatever, the Spanish Empire, there was always the nation state as the core, and then there was the overseas imperial territory, right, which the state has colonized. But there was a clear distinction between the metropolis and then the outer empire. But in Russia, there was no such clear distinction. The Russian state was colonizing the Russian people. So this is the peculiarity of Russia's internal colonization. And now this indeed brings forward the first big paradox of Russian history, because Russia indeed was an empire. The late British historian Geoffrey Hosking has once famously said, Britain had an empire, but Russia was an empire, and perhaps still is. And I think he captured here the key dilemma that Russia is facing today, the inability to become a nation state, the inability to give up being an empire, because Russia has never been a nation state. Russia has never lived outside an imperial format. Russia, we even don't know where Russia is. What is it? Is it a Muscovy of 16th century or 14th century? Is it the, the Moscow Principality, which is basically Moscow within Moscow's bigger beltway? Is it the central Russian lands, the area of serfdom, which was established in the full serfdom was established in the 17th century? Is Caucasus Russia? Is Urals Russia? Is Siberia Russia? Is Far East Russia? The answer is we don't know. We don't know where Russia lies. We know where Russian state is, where Russian empire lies, but we don't know where the Russian nation really is. So this is a big question, and this is a big peculiarity of Russian development over this 500 years. So then we're coming to the issue of the crisis of this big imperial body in the 20th century. Indeed, as you all know, 20th century was a century of the breakup of empires, the death, the end of all empires. And Russia had experienced death twice in the 20th century, in 1917 and in 1991. But this death was never complete, because after a short period, there was an Imperial Restoration, either under Stalin in the 1930s or under Putin in the 2000s, in 2010s, in the 21st century. So the big problem here is that Russia is an, so to say, uncompletely decomposed empire. So this is still an empire which cannot cease being one, which still feels as an empire in an age when empires are gone. So this is a very interesting historical conundrum here, and a completely broken empire, overwhelmed by memories of greatness and fears of its weakness. I think you should be well aware of this sense of grief, of the grievances, of the resentment that is there in Russia these days. It's really very interesting and instructive for a political psychologist, for instance. I think the textbooks will be written about it years and years later, analyzing how the authorities have taught Russians to feel as a defeated nation, a nation which had lost an empire. And in fact, you know, I'm methodologically, I'm a constructivist, right? I believe in social constructivism. I believe in political constructivism, that all narratives are constructed by the elite, that all ideologies and psychologies, indeed, are invented by the journalists, by the politicians, and then they're broadcast into the wider population to become political forces. So this is one interesting case of an invented grievance. A nation which was told that it has lost in the Cold War. Because, you know, I've lived through the period. I was there at the birth of the new Russia in August 1991. And I remember very well the 1990s. And there was never a sense of defeat of a nation, right? There was always, we were saying that we have won together with the civilized world. We have gotten rid of the big evil country, of the outmoded, outdated Soviet Union, and we now have a chance to move into the future, to join the European Union, to become a democratic country, to build a new market economy. And this was the spirit of the 1990s. Yes, this was a hard time. There was a time of a breakup. Although I have to admit that the Soviet breakup was not as tragic as, for instance, we have seen at the time as the Yugoslav breakup. That the human loss, of course, was no comparison with the events which transpired in other parts of the world, for example, in Rwanda. It was a hard time, but I wouldn't say this was a tragic time. It was a time of finding new identity for dozens of new nations. And then when Putin came in the 21st century, and as Russia started its restoration project, its classical thermidor, which always happens after revolution, the new ideology which emerged, the new slogan which the elites and which the propaganda had taught the nation, was that we have lost. We have a losing nation. As Putin has once famously said, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century was the breakup of the Soviet Union. Like, give me a break. Wasn't there a Second World War? Wasn't there a Holocaust? Wasn't there a First World War? Really? The breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century? But for him and for many Russians, this is true. So suddenly they said, wait a moment. No, we've lost a great nation. We've lost a great country. And suddenly grievance comes to the fore and becomes a basis, a platform for building a new identity, for building a new political ideology. Much as had happened in Germany in the 1930s, in the 1920s and the 1930s, a country which was taught to think that it had lost, right? It had lost in the Weimar Republic. It had lost due to the Dolchstoß, the stab in the back by capitalism, by the West, by the Jews, and so on. And this was the moment when the German fascism was born. So much in the same way, the contemporary Russian identity is born out of this post-imperial resentment, ressentiment, as they call it in French, through this invented defeat. A frustrated nation was born. And against this background, Putin took office. He was basically appointed by Yeltsin. I think this is an interesting whole big narrative, how an unknown FSB officer came to the top of the Russian pyramid. And in general, the comeback of the so-called Siloviki, the uniformed officials, the power ministries that took office in Russia in the 21st century. And Putin has started his big project of restoration, of restoring past glory, past identity, and indeed, he has made history the main building blocks of the new Russian identity. So Russia, indeed, in the past 20 years has been going on through a period of demodernization, the period of retropolitics, of archaization of its political management, of its many social ways, of its foreign policy. So today, Russia is a country living in its past. Today, Russia resembles a man, a human who is trying to walk forward with his head turned back. So this is a very precarious way of moving. But this is precisely what is happening in my country these days. So let me name several elements of this restoration project on which Putin had embarked. Well, there are 6 altogether. And first, this is the state, the big state. Over and over, I have to say this when I talk about Russian political history, when I talk about the organization of Russian society, of Russian territory. State in Russia is everything. Russia is a statist country. And the 1990s were just a small period of a rollback of this Leviathan, the rollback of a big state. And against the big state, the pockets of independence have emerged, of territorial independence, of civic independence, of economic independence. But then in the 2000s, this has been a very significant rollback of the state. The Leviathan took over these pockets of independence and emerged in its previous monstrous format. So the bureaucracy came back, the mass of the regulation came back, the state economy came back, and the big repressive apparatus came back, right? So Putin has succeeded in rebuilding the big, archaic, and clumsy Russian state. The center of the state is his authoritarian rule, which has now been made constitutional. There was a constitutional coup d'etat, if you wish, last year, 2020, using the pretext of the pandemic. The Kremlin managed to get through its amendments to the constitution, which have basically hollowed out any kind of a democratic sense of the constitution, and which have allowed Putin to rule almost indefinitely. It had famously, this word obnulili, nullified Putin's previous presidential terms and gave him a green light to move the rule of the 2024 for another 12 years. So Putin may last well until 2036. So this is now we can say that Russia is a certified personalist dictatorship, a personalist autocracy, right? And that the appearances of democratic legitimacy are just mere simulations. Yes, Russia has a parliament, a bicameral parliament, Russia has a government, but indeed these are all appearances, as Russia had of them so many in its history, the Potemkin villages. And then the real power is vested with the Kremlin, and to be more specifically with one person, with the president. There's only one political body in Russia, and this is the body of the president. So the politics is really very personalistic, and all other institutions are indeed substitutions. So you can even say that Russia is a constitutional monarchy of sorts. And indeed, many political scientists use medieval metaphors trying to understand and conceptualize present-day Russian politics. A second important element of this restoration project is violence. Violence has come back to Russia as a principal legitimizing force. Because until recently, there was still some kind of electoral legitimacy and public legitimacy. The authorities were concerned about the ratings, about the popularity. Well, they still are concerned, but I think this is more ritualistic for them. But indeed, the true legitimacy these days for the Kremlin, for the authorities, for Putin personally, comes from violence. They have built and trained a very well-oiled machine of violence for the past 4 or 5 years. This infamous special police squads, Rosgvardia, the National Guard, and then special detachments, riot detachments, crowd control detachments, which you have seen in full glory in the streets of Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other Russian big cities during the recent protests in January and February 2021 after the arrest of Alexei Navalny. I mean, the use of violence has, of course, a big pedigree, a big tradition in Russian history. And this time, once again, this violence doesn't stop at killing or, well, poisoning, trying to kill the political opponents, as happened last year with the poisoning of the prominent opposition politician Alexei Navalny. An attempt which has spectacularly failed. But then Navalny, as you know, chose to return back to Russia, to his homeland, and made this sort of, I would say, a biblical sacrifice, giving his body to the authorities and, you know, thrown to jail for an indefinite period of time. Because it's obvious that this first term of 2.5 years, which he was given using in this fake court trial, is just the beginning. The Kremlin will keep him in jail as long as Putin rules, as long as Kremlin wishes. So we can have another Nelson Mandela in a Russian case. So talking of violence, I would say that Russia has finally arrived into Belarus. It's very interesting in the play. We have observed the developments in Belarus for recent years, knowing that Belarus is indeed, in its modes of government, is several years ahead of Russia. So Lukashenko had for decades built his own version of the Soviet Union. He is a typical Soviet kolkhoz director, and he was running his country as one big kolkhoz. And he was also using violence in a very Soviet way. He was for years killing his political opponents, threatening the opposition, you know, beating the rallies, the small opposition rallies on the street, you know, making people themselves pay for this beating, pay for the executions, and so on. And then we have seen this, and there was a saying among us in Moscow, well, wait, but this is not Minsk. This may be happening in Minsk. Minsk is a quasi-Soviet dictatorship, but not in Russia. But 2020 and 2021 has changed it all. So we are now living in Minsk as well, right? The extent of violence and the personalist dictatorship without any respect to Europe, to international norms and regulations, to human rights, has been built in Russia as well. So in the sense, these two Slavic nations have merged in building the same autocracy. It's the same personalist dictatorship. The third element of this restoration project is a nationalized economy. I mean, Russia may sound as a capitalist economy, but indeed it is a state capitalism in which up to 80% of all assets are in the state hands. So Russia is ruled by major state corporations, which act as main employers and main distributors of goods inside the country. The small and mid-sized enterprises, the small private businesses is really a shrinking part of the economy. And it has been furthermore killed by the COVID restrictions, by the pandemic and the lockdown. So it has been at least, you know, halved in major Russian cities, the small businesses. So any significant business in Russia is in the state's hands, directly or indirectly controlled by state representatives who turn out to be part of the FSB. This has to be stated separately, of course, as also part of this big violence project, the omnipresence of the secret police. And I have to say that the FSB these days is much, much stronger and has much fewer controls and checks than the KGB of the Soviet years. Because in the Soviet Union, KGB was still under party control. Now there's no party control. There's no party. It's like Единая Россия, United Russia is another simulacrum, is another fake, is another Potemkin village. So the real rulers of Russia is the secret service with Putin as a descendant of the secret service on top. So these are the people who call the shots that decide on Russia's foreign policy and Russian domestic politics, on Russian elections. And these people are omnipresent in any institution, in any university, in any major state corporation. So we have to be aware that these are the true people that run Russia these days. The fourth thing, which I have to say about Putin's Restoration project, is a corporate society. Russia, once again, as I mentioned in the past, is a society attached to the state, a society created by the state. Russian people are defined not as like a middle class, upper middle class, not at all. We Russians are defined by our affiliation to certain state corporations. So this is a corporate state, a state in a way as a medieval Russia divided into various, what we call in Russia, soslovia, estates. So there's the state of power, then there's the state of the state employees, of the budget workers, and they are assembled, the entire society, the entire country is assembled along this budgetary lines. Because, for instance, if we look at the whole regiments of support for Vladimir Putin and for the Russian ruling regime, because we see that they all line up according to their affiliation. They all vote according to their affiliation. Then the military personnel vote in the barracks, and then the teachers, they vote in school, and they participate in falsifying the elections in schools, at the precincts, at the voting stations organized in schools. So teachers in Russia are one of those complicit in the falsification of election. And then the medics, they vote in hospitals and they are organized in hospitals. So almost every single person in Russia is attached, is on a hook to a certain state institution, to a certain state corporation. I remember friends of mine, sociologists, they were traveling and lecturing to big audiences in Siberian cities along the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And I remember they were coming to audiences of 500-600 people. And of these 500, everyone, literally everyone, was a state employee of one or different sort, because he or she would be working in a local administration and municipal administration and housing. He was an employee of the Russian railroads, was an employee of the Russian mail, Почта России, and so on. So the entire society in Russia is made by the state. And this is the kind of a new society which was created under Putin and Russia. And its loyalty to the current regime is very much defined by its budgetary dependence. Right, so talking about the big figures of support to Putin, we have to keep this in mind, that Russia is a society of states. The fifth element of Putin's restoration project was a single ideology. Although, of course, the Russian constitution prohibits having one ideology in Russia, as was communism in the Soviet Union. In Russia these days, there's a consolidated conservative ideology of, I would say, nationalism, rather chauvinistic nationalism, orthodoxy, and something new, which I would call a politics of memory, the ideology of victory. The true Russian religion these days is not really orthodoxy. The true Russian religion is 9th of May. Russia's religion is victory. Right, and they're like processions on the street with people carrying not icons but portraits of the people killed in Second World War. And much of Russian identity comes from the fact of victory in 1945, because we see stickers on the car, windows on the rear windows of the cars, and bumper stickers. Спасибо деду за победу. Thank you, grandfather, for the victory. Or like profiles of AK-47 machine guns and the St. George's ribbons, which symbolize the victory, and so on. So this is really the kind of a ritual, a daily, almost daily liturgy, which is being served in Russia, a liturgy of victory. And this is part of the new ideology, which puts the state on top of the individual, which puts, Russia first ideology, kind of a Russia's renationalization project. Which happens in many places in the world, right? We had Brexit, we had America First and Trumpism in the United States. But part of this project, of this global comeback of the state and the nation, was this Putin's project of building a new Russian ideology. And finally, last but not least, is the comeback of the Russian Empire. And this is the last attempt to recreate, to rebuild the Russian Empire in the 21st century. And it is, of course, no coincidence that Putin lamented the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, the breakup of the Soviet Union. And he himself sees his historical mission as a restorer of the great empire, at least parts of it. So, of course, it was his big crusade. It was his big project, the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Because it was seen by him, it was seen by a frustrated society as the first step to the recreation of the big empire. And actually, much of the society is now waiting for him to make the same steps with respect to Belarus, right? To kind of submerge Belarus maybe as a part of Russia, as 6 new regions in the Russian federal structure. And the permanent threats to our Baltic neighbors, threats to northern Kazakhstan, which is Russian populated. So not necessarily coming directly from the Kremlin, but at least this ideology of Imperial Restoration and this whole parlance of empire, right? That Russia has no allies in the world except its navy and its army. Right, this famous quote from Alexander III, and so on. So this is a kind of neo-imperial project that is going on in Russia, and as they called in the previous period of Russian history, "Собирание земель," collecting the lands of Russia. But finally, I have to say, paradoxically, this has a very reverse effect. Putin is trying to collect the lands of the Russian Empire, but in fact, he is leading the final act of the Russian Empire. He is presiding over the breakup of the Russian Empire. I understand that the audience, of course, has here a special interest in Ukraine. And I think Ukraine is a very interesting case in point. Very sensitive for Russia. Russian imperial and post-imperial consciousness can never put up with the independence of Ukraine. Right, because as I think Zbigniew Brzezinski had a very sharp observation for this, that Russia can only be an empire with Ukraine. Ukraine is the litmus test of Russian imperialism. If, like, without Ukraine, Russia is no longer an empire. And even for those who haven't read Brzezinski, they feel it. They feel that Ukraine used to give legitimacy to being a greater Russia, right? If you have a smaller Russia, right, Malorussia, right, then you can justify being a greater Russia. And then suddenly the smaller Russia was gone, right? And this was a very heavy blow, the Ukrainian independence, to Russian nationalism. Even to those who, we thought was of a liberal formation, it was Ukraine was the biggest litmus test for Russian liberals. Like, I'm reminded of a famous and I think awful verse by Joseph Brodsky on the independence of Ukraine, where this beloved poet of the Russian intelligentsia made this absolutely chauvinistic and insulting statements about Ukrainian independence. So therefore was Russian interference in the second Maidan in 2013 and 2014. Therefore was the Russian annexation of Crimea, which was so much greeted by the majority of the population in Russia. And therefore it was the Russian instigation of a civil war in Donbass and interference in Donbass and early attempts, to cut off Donbass from the rest of Ukraine, and even, plans, for instance, to have a major warfare in Ukraine, which, of course, failed spectacularly. But interestingly enough, I think the result of Russia's imperial intervention in Ukraine between 2014 and today is the fact that Russia has now lost Ukraine for good, forever. Ukraine has now finally parted with Russia, and precisely through Putin's action. So I know this may sound, a bit, paradoxical, maybe even cynical, but I think in the future, in the history textbooks, Ukrainians should be grateful to Putin as the man who has contributed to Ukrainian independence, by creating Ukrainian political nation, which now leads a war in Donbass, right? Which is now a war nation, a nation much more aware of its identity than it was 10 years ago. So I think this is interesting, and this is happening everywhere in the post-Soviet space. Wherever Russia has an expansion project, whenever Russia wants to embark on some kind of a neo-imperial policy, there's such a strong anti-Russian sentiment that these parts of the former empire are now lost for good. I think this is now happening in Belarus, because the current Belarusian protest is not really, didn't used to be anti-Russian, right? It was anti-Lukashenko, it was anti-authoritarian. And our Belarusian friends didn't really realize the fact that the true enemy of Belarusian independence is not indeed Lukashenko, right? He even posed himself as the only protector of Belarusian independence. But the keys to Belarusian independence and the keys to building a new Belarusian identity are indeed in Moscow. And now, as Moscow has, acted to protect this totalitarian dictator, Alexander Lukashenko, there's a greater understanding among the Belarusians that there will be no Belarusian independence without further detachment from Russia. So I think in the long run, Russia is bound to lose Belarus as it has lost Ukraine and by the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And, this game goes on everywhere. Russia's action has caused NATO forward deployment in the Baltic states, right? Because in the conditions of the annexation of Crimea, of course, our Baltic neighbors have to be aware of the possible incursions by Russia. Kazakhstan, of course, is very worried by frequent pronouncements from the Russian nationalists of the plans, of some kind of intervention in North Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan too is drifting away from the Russian orbit as much of the Central Asia, towards China, towards Turkey. So we see before our eyes the decomposition of this chimera, of this plan to rebuild the former Russian Empire. So in the end, I think Putin will end up to be the gravedigger of the Russian Empire rather than the restorer of it. So, so this would be like the main message of my presentation today, that the threatening and menacing as it sounds these days, that the restoration of the big state, the restoration of the big Russian Empire, I mean, these are the last attempts of a doomed historical projects. I think these attempts have failed, will fail. They are they're doomed, and it may take several years. It may well take a decade, maybe a couple of decades, but in the longer run, I think that this Putin-esque state will not outlive its founder, its creator. So there is a biological limit to the current period of the Russian imperial drama. And this is indeed, I think, the last act of the Russian imperial drama. The empire which had failed to collapse twice, in 1917 and 1991, and now it's collapsing for the third time. But it is a long, arduous, painful, and bloody process. And this process, I think, is frustrating, but also for us, the observers, immensely interesting. So I would end this presentation on this, schizophrenic split between frustration and fascination of a political scientist. And I will be happy to listen to your questions, and I will also now look into the questions which are in chat. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Medvedev. That was a fascinating, in-depth presentation. I see we do have a couple of questions already in the chat, and I'm just going to encourage anybody that has questions to put them into the chat, and hopefully we'll also have a few minutes to answer some questions in person afterwards. So the first question that came through the chat is from Elena, And she's written, with the nature of modern approaches to show history, that winners rewrite the story, how can one get to the truth? Now, when everyone is able to write and promote ideas, with the huge difference in delivering information through the internet, now when it is so easy comparing to old times when there were few people able to write books or deliver the information, and the disunity of all countries and even cities or smaller places.
I think the short question to this that there is no truth in history. There are facts, then the interpretations of facts. And I think by 2021, we should recognize that history is a multitude of opinions and a multitude of truths. And what we have to learn is to respect someone else's truth and to try to live with somebody else's truth. Like, for instance, Second World War, I don't think there will be ever a unified international narrative concerning the war. How can we have a single, narrative between a Russian and a Pole on the beginning of the war, on the role of the Red Army? Was it a liberator of Poland or was it an occupier of Poland? How can we have a single narrative between Russia and Lithuania, for instance? And so many other things. So I think the point is we'll have to look for, smallest common denominator and for respect, which I think I would repeat this word is respect and the sensitivity to someone else's truth. And I think the awareness and readiness to accept your past misdeeds and your past mistakes. So this, I think, is a new mode of memorial politics, of memory politics these days.
Thank you. From Father Taras in Winnipeg, what is Putin's end game regarding Ukraine, and in particular Crimea, Donbass, and Luhansk? Please explain. Expansion of power.
I don't think he has an end game. I think his game is really interfering, spoiling, and intoxicating. It's a losing game, basically, that Russia is leading. Russia does not have a positive agenda for any conflict that it interferes in. So it has some nuisance value, it has some interference value, and it builds its influence on interfering into the cracks in the world order and like enlarging these cracks. In Ukraine, well, under current Russian leadership, I don't see any possibility to give up on Crimea. And indeed, it is, even the talk about Crimea is criminalized in Russia. You can even say a word suggesting that Crimea is annexed, that Crimea is Ukrainian, that it is not internationally accepted. I mean, these are now even talk like this is like criminally punishable in Russia. So the authority is so much concerned about the legitimacy of this move and, making the world recognize it. So I don't think it is ever possible under the current regime in Russia. Donbass, Donetsk and Luhansk, I think it's a totally different game, and Russia attempted it, but the concept of Ruski Mir, of Russian world, had failed. And Russia would like, I think, to push it back into the hands of Ukraine. Having ruined it, having devastated it, having relocated millions of people. Now Russia would like to quietly withdraw, but still have, still have a hook in the heart of Ukraine, in the center of Ukraine, having an influence on the neighboring country. So I think what Putin wants in the end is not really ruining the independence of Ukraine. So this is now passé, right? We are past this point. But he wants to have the same in Belarus. He wants to have an influence and the ability to damage and influence and have control over the neighboring states. Not allowing the free movement towards the West, towards Europe, because Russia sees itself with Europe as a zero-sum game, right? Rather than a win-win game between Russia and EU, but it's a zero-sum game, like if EU wins, we lose. So this was, the fatal mistake which Russia made in Ukraine. So yes, once again, I think there is no end game, but there's a perpetual spoiler.
Thank you. From Irena, any hope that civil society will get consolidated in Russia within the next 5 years?
That's a hard one. Frankly, if you ask me, I don't believe within the next 5 years it's bitterly disunited. It's pressured by the state. It's frightened by the police. Any foreign interference is impossible. Even accepting any money from abroad, you immediately announce the foreign agent. The internet is increasingly getting under Chinese-style control. They have just tried to slowed down Twitter yesterday in Russia, like killing half of the government websites in the process, and so on. So, I mean, Russia's present-day history is really one big story of pressuring and terrorizing the civil society. And secondly, most important, I don't see a single agenda for the civil society. I don't see a uniting point. I see a lot of individual points of assembly, right? Points of mobilization of civil society. For instance, in Khabarovsk, people for almost a year have protested against the replacement and the imprisonment of their former governor. For instance, in Arkhangelsk Oblast, in Shias, people were protesting against building the dumping site where they will be bringing garbage from Moscow and from Central Russia, dumping it in the tundra, in the forest in Arkhangelsk region. In other places, in Ingushetia, people were protesting against redrawing the borders with Chechnya. In Bashkiria, once again, they were protesting against, industrial development of their sacred mountain. So in many cities, people are protesting against building the new churches because churches are built instead of parks in Russia, and there's like anti-church protests in many places in Russia. So this happens, but I mean, it's not scalable. They're not supported by other regions, other people. So they're local conflagrations, but I don't see a unified national agenda for the civil society. I mean, so it's a mixed answer. I mean, I'm not overly pessimistic. I would say that people are getting more politically engaged, that people are getting more politically concerned and troubled by the terror that the state had opened against its own population. But there's very few institutions, there are very few channels, there are very few points of assembly for the civil society to make it a significant political force.
Do you have any vision of what sort of changes could happen in the coming years, considering that Putin is not immortal? For example, would Russia or Putin consider, in your opinion, how important it is to develop small business, or do you see monopolies to chew all the small ones in the future?
Well, there are two different questions. First is, Putin's immortality. Yes, of course. I think we're really, it's an amazing period. We're living in a biological period of Russian history, right? We're all depending on Putin's health, on Putin's body. And I think the system will not last longer than Putin himself. And there are many, because he has not so far clearly pointed a successor, and the system is built on cleavages, on personal, on permanent war between various parts of the system, even between various parts of the Siloviki. And there's also a shrinking pie, shrinking spoils, the shrinking oil revenues, shrinking budgets. So we can see these problems looming on the horizon. But I don't want to be a sort of a predicting the future after Putin. I frankly can't say anything. I don't know. There might be a civil war. There might be a war of all against all. There might be a gradual turn to normalcy, like what happened after Stalin's death. It's really impossible to predict. Like, imagine we're in the Soviet Union in 1950. Okay, we know that Stalin is not immortal. Can we imagine the kind of the evolution that would happen in the Soviet Union after 1953, after the death of Stalin? So, okay, with hindsight, you can say, yes, okay, we could properly project some kind of a soul liberalization, partial liberalization, but living in 1950, it's very hard to say those. So by the same token, living in 2021, it's impossible to imagine which direction Russia should take. Objectively, yes, I think in the end, by the end of the whatever, middle of the 21st century, like I can talk about big periods. Once the oil runs out, Russia will have to open itself to the outside world and become modernized and so on, because Russia is basically is a mono-resource country. Russia is basically a big animal sitting on the oil pipeline, oil and gas pipeline. That's all you have to know about the country, right? So once oil and gas, once we go through the world energy revolution, oils and gas are replaced by renewables, right? Or they are no longer needed in the global economy. So Russia has no place in the world economy beyond oil and gas. So of course this will ruin the current system of rents. This will ruin the current regime, and it's really hard to predict. Will there be at all any Russia in the world without oil? In the world after oil. But once again, I think this is the middle of the century. This is maybe 20, 30, 40 years away. So it's hard to say from today. Okay, the another one was develop the small business. Well, of course, it's important to develop the small business. The point is, I mean, who will develop it, and under one conditions? It's very difficult to have a small business in Russia these days, and there are like small percentages of people that could be possibly interested in doing this, because you're overwhelmed by taxation, by the oversight, by the various administrators, the interest of the Siloviki, and so on. So I really think there's the great patriots of Russia and the people that endeavor to do the small business in this absolutely toxic waters these days in Russia. Yes, it is important, but so far at this point, I don't see it as a significant political economic force in Russia. They're like at the lower end of the food chain.
So another question, according to President Zelensky today, the International Center for Countering Disinformation will start operating in Ukraine in the coming days. Do you think that such an institutional addition can make a difference in the not fully post-colonial space Ukraine occupies, given Russia's intransigence?
Well, that's I have to try to make sense of the last sentence of the question. This is very intricately constructed, but generally I think this is a good initiative because of course disinformation and fake news and Russian propaganda machine is one of the key elements in Russia's foreign policy and in today's politics in the world. So any kind of awareness and fighting fake news, fighting disinformation, fighting the information warfare is necessary, and yeah, and I think that is a proper policy here. I see, and as I can read. Next question is a good one. Was Putin inevitable? If not Putin, would there have been another such leader? It's a tremendous question, and frankly, I still have no answer, because it's generally speaking on the nature of history as such. Is history accidental or is history inevitable? Do you take a Hegelian view of history, that there is a purpose and a direction in history, and this Hegel famously wrote, this moat was digging its root somewhere under the earth and then emerges at some point in the form of a Prussian state. So is there some moat digging underneath the Russian history, and now it emerged in the face in the shape of Putin? I don't know. We've been recently entertaining this idea with colleagues because we had an anniversary of the assassination of Boris Nemtsov recently, 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago. Nemtsov was assassinated 2015, 27th of February 2015. And he might have been the president of Russia, because he was, Yeltsin had said this several times, that Nemtsov would be his successor. He was a very popular governor of Nizhegorодskaya Oblast. He was young, he was outspoken, and had there been a different sequence of events, a different management of the crisis in 2008, the default of Russia's obligations. So after this default, Yeltsin was, terribly frightened of instability, and then he just, yearned for stability, and then the idea of a KGB officer, of a security officer, came forward, and then he picked up Putin, and the Russian history turned the way it turned. So I don't know. I don't have a definite answer. It's definite that Putin has shaped the Russian history the way it had. But I also think that there was, at least my presentation was that about the objectivity of all this development. I think the fact that Russian Empire had not ended in 1991, that many elements of Russian imperialism have not been deconstructed. So maybe it was necessary to live through this last period of Russian imperialism before Russia can finally emerge as a modernized nation state in the 21st century. So in some sense, this purification, this purge of Russia by Putinism might have been inevitable. But, this is really my fantasy, and this is really a very philosophical question to which I think nobody will have a ready answer. So,
thank you. Sergei, did you want to go on to the next question then about, do you see any connection between the Christ and Navalny in terms of offering the sacrifice for the good of the rest?
Well, there's a lot of interpretation along these lines. It's very interesting, the turn of Navalny to also Christian metaphors in his last speeches in court, his last word in the court. Suddenly, he sounds very biblical, and in general, his whole this whole story of return to Russia, and it's like Christ giving himself up to the guards in the garden of Gethsemane, and he knew, of course, that he would be arrested and his life would be threatened, and he will undergo unfair trial. So yes, you can say so, and many people say so. The problem is Russia today is not really a Christian country. It will not really appreciate this kind of sacrifice. But what's important is that Moralny, I think, now has evolved to be a moral leader of the nation. And I can only hope that the world will recognize this kind of a moral stature and the bravery of this opposition of the individual to the state machine. So really, it's I'm honestly believe that he is now the figure, the scale of Andrei Sakharov, Nelson Mandela, Václav Havel, and other famous stories of the opposition of individual versus the state. And in Mandela's case, it took 27 years in jail. So I don't know how long it will take Navalny. I hope he will survive his imprisonment and he will emerge as a politician in the new Russia, in the post-Putin Russia. We can only hope on this. But yes, there is, once again, I would say, many commentators evoke Christian metaphors, as does Navalny himself.
Thank you. We have a thank you for a wonderful lecture and sharing your expertise with all of us. Could you please share your thoughts on Russia's stakes and interest in the recent Nagorno-Karabakh conflict? Could you please also share your thoughts on Putin's grand strategy in the former Soviet space?
Well, as I think with Ukraine and Belarus, Putin uses this to curb the interference by other regional players, like Turkey. In this sense, China in other countries, in Nagorno-Karabakh, this is Turkey, and keeping its allies at bay. Also, I think one of his ideas was punishing Nikol Pashinyan, because he was a democratically elected leader, a leader elected by the Maidan, a leader elected by the riot, so to say, by the popular uprising. And this is profoundly troublesome for anyone in Moscow, because the main fear that rules the Kremlin now is the fear of the Maidan, the fear of the square, the fear of the revolution. And there was the Armenian Maidan, which had brought Pashinyan to power, so Pashinyan had to be curbed, Pashinyan had to be punished. Which precisely happened in the renewed Karabakh conflict. Generally, what is the grand strategy? I don't think there's a grand strategy, especially in capital letters. I don't think there's at all any strategy in Russia. Russia is not a strategic place. The strategy is in China. In Russia, we just, we plan a week ahead. And even that is very difficult. I frankly don't know what will happen the week later. In my country, in my own life, I absolutely have no idea. It's a very interesting time to be living in Russia these days. And I think the strategy is damage limitation and retaining as much control as possible in the former Soviet space, and building and preventing the infiltration of other geopolitical, what is seen as geopolitical opponents, China, Turkey, the European Union. So this would be, I would say, the strategy, the instinct that drives Russian politics in the post-Soviet space. But I don't think that there's any restoration project in mind. In general, if you think about like strategic, it's not really strategic planning. If there's a question about the Kremlin thinking, of course, I cannot get in their heads. There's very secretive. There's no public policy in Russia. It's not discussed what these people think and what makes them make their decisions. But from some indirect impressions which I get, is that the Siloviki, the uniformed bureaucracies that run Russia, they sincerely believe in the inevitability of the future world war, and which will happen somewhere towards the end of the 2020s, somewhere in the 2030s, and Russia has to be prepared for the inevitable world war, which will be either for oil, for the other resources, because of migration, because of Islam, and that Russia should prevail in the future world war, retaining its nuclear arsenal, retaining its geopolitical position, and so on. So believe it or not, but there are people in the Kremlin, and mind you, Russia is the only major industrial country in the world that is ruled from a medieval fortress, right? So there are people in the Kremlin that really build their politics on the inevitability of the next world war. This is really frightening, but many people say this is the fact and the rationale behind their thinking.
I don't know if you're able to see the most recent question there. Critics argue that Russia has suffered from an overdose of market fundamentalism, while neoliberals still insist that Russia has not gone far enough in unleashing genuine market forces. What are your near and further future views on this issue?
No, I don't think that Russia had any sincere market fundamentalism, although liberalism actually made a big impact on Russian domestic and foreign policy, and indeed they are part of Putinism. They were very comfortably built into the current power structure, into the current power system, the economic liberals. Look at this, famous Chubais, the remains of the Gaidar administration, Alexei Kudrin, like Anton Siluanov is seen as a liberal. But frankly, I think in today's Russian politics, we cannot talk about market fundamentalism when there is no market in Russia at all. Right, Russia is a heavily statist economy run by the state corporations and overseen by security officers, permeated by corruption networks, kickbacks, huge schemes of stealing the state budget. I mean, what kind of market fundamentalism are we talking about? So there never was a true, Adam Smith market, like the free hand of the market in Russia at work. So I think this will continue. The statist involvement in the economy will continue, will grow stronger, especially as the size of the pie doesn't get any bigger, as Russian resources thin out, as Russia does not have its own resources for modernization. And so this will be the game of splitting up the remaining resources in the Russia's rent economy. Russia is not an economy of the markets. Russia is an economy of rents.
Great. We have time for a couple more questions. I have one more that came directly to me. What do you think if the Lukashenko regime remains in power in the next couple of years? Will it lead to greater integration of Belarus and Russia, or even incorporation of Belarus?
No, I don't think so. As I mentioned, Putin is interested, I think Kremlin is interested in keeping these nations at bay, in its fist, not taking responsibility for these populations, but, controlling them by proxy. So Lukashenko, I think most likely he will be replaced in a year or two. He has become so unpopular in Belarus itself. He's like the enemy of the nation, number one, like the monster, the blood-thirsty monster, as most Belarusians see him. And in this sense, I think Putin would try to place a more pro-Moscow candidate, which would be easily controllable, which would control the big monetary flows through Belarus, because there is a huge export potential. There is, Russian oil export schemes, which are the backbone of the Belarusian regime, of the Belarusian budget. So they would be interested in control over the schemes, but they would not like to take on board the Belarusian population, like another addition to the Russian budget. Not really necessary.
And I think we've got one final question here. To what extent do you think bribery is not letting Russian economics grow?
Well, corruption is systemic in Russia. Corruption is endemic in Russia. Indeed, it's part of the Russian economics. Some say there is some scholars in our high school economics that said it's the second Russian GDP wasn't corruption, and there was some bold economics that say that it should be factored into the GDP. Bribe is a part of the GDP. It's a service done for a certain fee. So why shouldn't we count the amount of bribe in the GDP? No, but this is more like a joke. I think, and talking seriously, of course, this is a systemic problem which prevents Russia from modernizing itself, from the fair and strategic distribution of resources in the country. And once again, it cannot be treated by the current regime. Indeed, today, the State Duma had adopted a law which relieves the state officials from responsibility for bribery and corruption under special circumstances, when they were forced to take a bribe. So it's amazing that this legislation was even adopted. So they're even moving away the responsibility for these kind of things. But of course, I think also corruption will be a big issue in repressive policy, because this is something to keep the elite at bay. It's important for Siloviki and for corruption, for the administration, to have everyone engaged, to be everyone implicit in corruption, because everyone who is in power in Russia these days know that there's a special folder somewhere with his or her bribes, and they're like sort of buying loyalty of the population. So not of the population, of the elite. Nobody will become too independent knowing that a corruption investigation can be started any minute against him or her. So corruption is necessary for the governance system in Russia.
We're gonna squeak one last question in here before we wrap up. Are there any sanctions currently imposed against Russia by the European Union, or the US because of the ongoing war in Donbass?
No, not that I know. The Donbass is not a reason for sanctions. There are sanctions for Crimea, there's the Magnitsky, there's the Navalny sanctions, but not the Donbass sanctions. There is a Minsk process going on, there is a negotiation process against Donbass. I think it's a good question. In an ideal world, yes, there should be. But there's no, so to say, certified engagement of Russia. We know, of course, from many sources that this is Russia instigated, that Russia is implicated in the war in Donbass. But there is no officially recognized, politically recognized fact of this that could lead to sanctions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Medvedev. This has been such a fascinating talk, and I think everybody's really enjoyed it quite immensely. Before we go, I am going to throw up a quick poll because this was our first time doing everything virtually. I would love for everybody to just take a minute to answer 2 short questions about whether or not they would attend a lecture in this format again, and what they thought the overall quality was. So thank you so much, everybody, for attending today. We were really excited to have so many people show up virtually on a Thursday afternoon. And thank you, Dr. Medvedev, for just the amazing presentation. I think this is a fantastic topic, and it was a very engaging presentation that you provided for us. And I know it's very late at home for you right now. So we're very grateful that you were able to join us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. The pleasure was mine, and it's really not that late. I usually work at this time, so it's my usual working time, and it's great to see you all gathered at this time, and then sending my greetings across the ocean.
Fantastic, and we hope you take care and are well. Stay well during this time, and we look forward to speaking with you again sometime in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Спасибо.
Bye-bye. Спасибо.
Спасибо.